I watched a young university student introduce themselves to a group recently. It was a fascinating, almost rehearsed moment. They didn't start with what they were studying or a hobby they loved, or even where they were from. Instead, they immediately recited a very specific, hyphenated list of terms regarding their gender, neurodivergence, and political alignment. They spoke these words with a kind of rigid, protective pride, as if presenting a passport at a border crossing. To them, this litany wasn't just a description, it was a shield. They seemed to believe that by stacking these categories correctly, they had fully defined their existence. But then the conversation shifted. Someone asked a simple, unscripted question. That's interesting, but what brings you joy right now? What does it actually feel like to be you today? The change was instantaneous. That confident, armored persona dissolved into total confusion. They stuttered. They didn't have a pre-approved label for the raw, messy experience of just being alive, and without that script, they seemed terrified to speak at all. It was a stark illustration of a modern tragedy. We have mistaken the map for the landscape. We have confused a grammatical placeholder, a tool designed for paperwork, with the infinite complexity of the human soul. Okay, so let's unpack this. I mean, that encounter, it really feels like it illustrates a profound shift in how we understand ourselves.
It really does.
We seem to be moving away from being defined by what we do, our actions, our roles, our character, and toward being defined by what we label ourselves as. And that label is somehow seen as a more authentic truth.
What's so fascinating and frankly a little startling is just how quickly the word identity has become sacred. It's treated almost like a spiritual possession, a fundamental right, and an indisputable personal truth that everyone else has to affirm.
Right. It's not just a description anymore. It's a demand.
Exactly. And so we really need to investigate how this single word, which is at its core just a tool of language, became so burdened with the entire weight of human existence, with all this moral urgency and ethical value.
So that's really our mission for this deep dive. We want to understand how this almost administrative reference point transformed into a central, and sometimes, let's be honest, a weaponized pillar of modern social life. We're going to try to trace the intellectual history of identity, then examine some of the surprising sociological consequences of what you call its linguistic inflation, and then finally maybe explore some frameworks that exist entirely outside this conceptual trap.
Right. We're stepping back from the endless debates about which identity is valid or more oppressed.
Yeah, we're asking a much more fundamental question. What is this word even doing to us?
When we approach this subject, we all carry this enormous bias. We just assume the concept of identity has always been central to human thought.
Of course. You think of Socrates' know thyself, and you immediately map that onto modern identity politics. It feels ancient.
And that's the trap right there. It's a historical anachronism. The historical record shows that the widespread use of the word identity in its modern social and psychological sense is, well, it's historically novel and, frankly, shockingly recent.
Okay, when you say recent, what are we talking about?
We are talking about the middle of the last century, really the post-1950s era.
Wow, that is genuinely counterintuitive. I mean, we use phrases like identity crisis or finding your true identity so casually, they feel like they're baked into the human psyche since, time began.
The evidence for this novelty is just overwhelming. If you trawl through historical works, popular books, magazines, political manifestos, even corporate literature, anything published before 1950, you find almost no reference to the concepts we now take for granted.
So no sexual identity, no ethnic identity.
None of it. The phrases identity crisis or finding one's identity simply weren't part of the conversation. People were discussing themselves, of course, but not through this specific lens of identity.
So the language of the self was there. People talked about their personhood, their character, their soul, their selfhood, but the actual vocabulary of identity was absent. Did that absence extend even to the giants of psychological and sociological thought?
Yes, it absolutely did. And this is where the historical lens offers the most profound challenge to our modern assumptions. We read foundational thinkers like Sigmund Freud or W.E.B. Du Bois or George Herbert Mead and Georg Simmel, and we just assume they were all about identity because their work touches on subjectivity and the self.
But they weren't using the word.
Rarely, if ever, in the way we use it today. A close reading confirms it. Their vocabulary, our vocabulary of identity, was superimposed on their work later on by subsequent generations of scholars.
That's a form of historical revisionism almost.
It's an anachronism. They were considering questions of individuality, subjectivity, and personhood, absolutely. But they did not construe their subject matter as a question of identity, as some kind of fixed internal possession you have.
So what did the word mean before this linguistic shift? If it wasn't about the self, what was it about?
Before this explosion, the term was reserved for a very narrow, primarily analytical application. It was rooted in philosophy and logic. Prior to the 1950s, identity referred to two key logical concepts. The first one is the sameness of an entity to itself, what philosophers sometimes call oneness. The second is the exact sameness of two separate entities, like when we say two companies have an identity of interests.
That sounds incredibly dry and abstract. It's a universe away from the passions of modern life.
It was. The older central use focused on what's called numerical identity. This is the classic philosophical puzzle of the persistence conditions of a person or an object over time. The question wasn't, who are you socially, but are you the same number one entity today that you were yesterday?
The ship of Theseus, the classic thought experiment. If the ship sails for 100 years and you slowly replace every single plank, every rope, and every sail, is it still the ship of Theseus at the end? The identity there is numerical, it's not existential or social.
Precisely. The discussion revolved around whether a person's body, or their soul, or their memory, provided the necessary conditions for that person to persist as numerically the same individual over time. The focus was on formal continuity, a concept completely removed from our current understanding of social belonging or personal expression or psychological self-definition.
So a philosopher back then would have been talking about a totally different thing.
Completely. And it's noted that even analytical philosophers found that non-philosophers were often puzzled and frankly disappointed when they were offered a discussion of this very logical, highly restricted sense of identity. It wasn't what they were looking for.
Okay, so this is a massive piece of the puzzle then. The experience of selfhood, of asking, who am I, that hasn't changed. Humans have always done that. But the vocabulary we use to frame that experience has fundamentally shifted. And that new vocabulary, identity, has created a whole new set of problems and possibilities. The explosion of what you call identity talk isn't just popularization, it represents substantially new uses of the term. The word itself is now performing this unprecedented social and political work.
It is indeed. It's performing a function it was never, ever meant to handle. To really understand this, we need to view identity through a cultural materialist lens and define it as a keyword, a concept that was developed by the literary critic Raymond Williams.
For those of us who aren't familiar with Williams, what exactly does he mean by a keyword in this context?
Williams argued that some words become so complex and so contested that their problems of meaning are inextricably bound up with the social and political problems they are used to discuss. Identity is a perfect example. Its novelty and its profusion are intimately connected to the social issues it has been used to grapple with since the mid-century. It's not just a definition, it's a symptom of our times.
A symptom?
I like that. So let's get into the mechanics of the word itself. Why was this word so susceptible to this linguistic inflation?
Well, if we delve into the mechanics, it gets really fascinating. We can trace the etymological roots back to the Latin identitas, which comes from idem, meaning the same. But if you follow idem back even further, you find it stems from the root id, which simply means it.
It. So the it thing.
That's right. Identity can literally be read as id plus entity, or the it thing. And this reveals its core original function. It is a pure placeholder or referent. It's a grammatical tool designed to point to something specific that remains consistent in discourse. It functions just like a name or a pronoun.
That is a devastating insight. I mean, if the word's deepest root means it thing, it suggests it was originally intended purely for classification, for file management. It's for the Census Bureau, the tax office, or the police department, a neutral tool for distinguishing one item from another. It was never meant to be a descriptor of the human soul. And you've just hit on the core philosophical mistake of our modern culture. We have confused this linguistic representation, the placeholder, the label, the grammatical tool, with the fullness of being, with the rich, messy, flowing reality of life itself. The placeholder has been mistaken for an essence.
The semantic evolution is just staggering when you put it like that.
It is. It transitioned from referencing an abstract formal property, the oneness of any entity, living or inanimate, to referencing a substantive human property, one that emphasizes distinction and difference from others, and which can be possessed or lost or even demanded from others.
So the implication for you, the individual, is profound then. If I'm asked to define my identity, I am being asked to commit to a grammatical it thing, a permanent file label, and then I'm asked to believe that this label is the truest expression of who I am.
Yeah.
But why did that older connotation of oneness persist and give this new social label so much power? Why did we want to believe the label was sacred?
Because of that persistence, that echo of oneness, identity functions today as a very powerful modern classificatory technology. Humans crave certainty and clarity, especially about ourselves and our position in the social hierarchy. Identity offers a way to package the self neatly.
It's tidy.
It's very tidy. But unlike older categories, say like race, which attempted to categorize and supply fixed, though often deeply flawed, criteria like biology, identity is what we can call an empty classifier.
An empty classifier, a container that can hold anything.
Precisely. It categorizes someone as of a particular kind without specifying the required criteria. Any attribute, your gender, a niche hobby, a psychological state, a political belief, anything can form the basis of an identity, so long as it is deemed essential or definitive of that person or group.
And once you put that attribute in the container and you designate it as an identity, it just solidifies. The fluidity of your existence is immediately stopped. It's frozen in place.
The designation of any social feature as an identity automatically invites essentialist thinking, even among people who claim to reject essence. It allows individuals or groups to be classed as a singular, particular type. It enables the declaration, I really am this kind of person, or this is who I fundamentally am.
And in doing so, it masks the very operation of the category itself.
Exactly. It hides the fact that it's imposing a static, typological assumption onto the dynamic reality of the self. We fall in love with the rigidity of the label because it feels protective. It feels certain.
So now we understand the word itself is this novel, essentializing placeholder. The next question has to be, what social and economic pressures in the mid-century caused this very specific word to suddenly explode and become the centerpiece of our public conversation?
Right.
Our sources suggest there are two distinct, almost entirely contradictory contexts of emergence.
Yeah.
Let's start with the economic one, commerce.
The first context is the rise of the post-war boom and the transition into a mass consumer society, particularly in the United States. The idea of personal identity as a psychological need emerged completely intertwined with burgeoning consumerism. The 1950s and 60s were characterized by the mass commercialization of social distinction and emulation, processes that thinkers like Veblen and Simmel had identified decades earlier.
So in a rapidly industrializing society, everyone started having access to the same things, the same suburban houses, the same appliances, the same cars. So the economy has a problem, right? How does it keep convincing people to buy more stuff if everyone is achieving the same level of material comfort?
They needed to sell distinction, and that's what they did. Commodities began to be marketed explicitly as a way for people to express themselves and their unique relation to others. The concept of personal identity offered the perfect psychological vehicle for this.
It created a new need.
It did. It provided a way to assert individuality and difference. It was sold as a vibrant antidote to the perceived gray uniformity of the mass society. The social anxiety of being just another number in the crowd was solved by the promise of having an identity that you could express through your purchases.
So the search for a unique self was pathologized. It was turned into an identity crisis. And then the market simultaneously offered the cure through superficial, specialized consumption.
And the utility of capitalism was profound and very subtle. The idea of personal identity offered a superficial, class-neutral means of distinction. It allowed consumers to feel unique and engaged in a pursuit of self-discovery. But paradoxically, it encouraged mass participation in consumption, which, as critical theorists like Adorno pointed out, has deeply homogenizing effects.
So you think you're being an individual by buying the niche product, but you're just participating in a different kind of mass market.
That's it. The word identity proved immensely useful to capitalism by obscuring the basic sameness that's engendered by the relentless logic of the commodity. It put this shiny label of individual distinction on top of mass-produced goods.
Okay, now let's pivot to the second and politically potent context. The new social movements of the 1960s. We're talking about the Black Power movement, the women's liberation movement, early gay liberation. This was the countercultural birth of social identity.
Yes, and these movements were reacting to the perceived limits of the earlier, more universalist civil rights campaigns. After achieving some formal legal equality, they were still facing deep structural exclusion and systemic racism. They realized that merely asking for inclusion based on the premise that all men are created equal was failing to address the fundamental cultural, social, and economic structures that maintain their oppression.
So they needed a new way to mobilize as a group, to assert their shared experience, but without resorting to affirming the discredited biological or racial deficiencies that had been used against them for centuries.
That's the strategic dilemma they faced. And the concept of social identity emerged to solve it. It presented difference in positive terms, based on shared culture, shared history, and common experiences, what we now call cultural essentialism, rather than relying on biological definitions. This emphasis created group pride, solidarity, and a whole new political basis for action.
And which movement was most instrumental in really crystallizing this new political use of identity?
The Black Power movement was absolutely central to this. The notion of identity became key to their newly articulated philosophy and their radical goals. Kwame Ture, who was formerly Stokely Carmichael, and Charles V. Hamilton, in their defining 1967 text Black Power, explicitly defined the movement as being focused on Black self-determination and Black self-identity.
That formulation sounds incredibly powerful. What was the radical intent behind that?
The intent was nothing short of revolutionary. They were challenging the very nature of society itself. They rejected the immense pressure to assimilate into what they called white values and systems. The struggle was for the right to create their own terms of self-definition, independent of the oppressor's gaze.
So this was not about getting a seat at the table. This was about building a new house.
Precisely. In the 1960s and 70s, social identity was deployed for a radical egalitarian use. It aimed for a fundamentally altered social order, and it saw the fight against various oppressions as structurally intertwined with challenging capitalism itself. The goal was rupture, not assimilation.
So we have these two births. The market birth, which is identity as a consumer brand, and the political birth, identity as a tool for radical liberation. What happens when the second, the political one, is absorbed by mainstream institutions and starts to operate under the market logic of the first?
That absorption is precisely what the political scientist Yascha Mounk critiques as the modern identity synthesis. And this synthesis represents a significant divergence from that initial universalist heritage that was championed by figures like Frederick Douglass or Martin Luther King Jr., who appealed to shared principles and inclusion for all.
So instead of asking for equality based on our shared humanity, the synthesis asks for treatment based on our group category.
Exactly. The modern synthesis often rejects that universalist heritage. Instead, it seeks to make how the state and other institutions treat individuals explicitly dependent on the identity groups they are a part of. Derek Bell, who's known as the founder of critical race theory, really encapsulated this shift when he argued that we should reject the defunct racial equality ideology of the civil rights movement.
Wow. To call it defunct.
Yes. He suggested that assimilation was inherently flawed because the fundamental structures of power were unchanged. So a different strategy was needed.
And this ideology, which often starts now in early education, encourages people to double down on their identities. This can lead to a very rigid understanding of social justice that prioritizes classification over open debate and can, ironically, reinforce the very social divisions it claims to be fighting.
And this leads directly to what some see as the erosion of meritocracy and traditional social norms. Let's look at a concrete example of this, a sociological consequence documented in our source material. This is the story of a man named Elias, a graphic designer.
And this story really illustrates how the currency of professional achievement, actual competence, gets devalued when identity becomes the dominant metric for evaluation.
It does. Elias was a graphic designer with a decade of high-level experience. He had a top-tier portfolio. He demonstrated leadership skills. He was applying for a senior director role that, by all traditional metrics, he was more than qualified for.
But his portfolio wasn't the main topic of conversation.
No. During the final selection stage, the committee's conversation pivoted dramatically away from his competence. The focus shifted to what they termed narrative gaps in his identity profile.
So he was being penalized not for any failures on his part, but for a perceived lack of a specific marketable category of identity?
Precisely. Because he didn't fit a marginalized category that was currently being prioritized by the company, his identity was viewed as a default, a blank space. It didn't offer the necessary group-based grievance narrative to satisfy the firm's diversity optics or maybe improve their ESG scores.
So his individual achievement, the creative work he had actually built over years, was completely overshadowed by the political capital associated with a group label that he lacked.
Yes.
This has to generate a profound sense of what sociologists call social enemy. For the listener who hasn't encountered that term before, anomie, as described by Emile Durkheim, refers to a state of normlessness, a breakdown of the traditional standards by which society guides individual behavior.
That's the key context here. Elias was experiencing anomie because the rules of the game had fundamentally changed overnight, without any warning. He was operating under the assumption of meritocracy, that the quality of your work and your demonstrated skill would lead to advancement. When competence became secondary to categorization, the established social norm was broken for him.
And what's the long-term sociological consequence when this shift happens at scale?
It fosters a really corrosive form of cynicism. When we replace individual achievement with group-based grievance narratives, we create a deep sociological instability. The competence of the individual becomes secondary to the political capital associated with their assigned or stated label. This is the inherent danger when identity functions as a zero-sum political currency. It incentivizes categorization over capability.
And the consequences aren't just limited to the professional world. They penetrate the realm of ideas, particularly in academia. We have a powerful illustration of the intellectual consequences in another story, the story of Sarah, a literature student. This one investigates how the concept of identity was transformed into a kind of weapon within critical theory.
Sarah entered her graduate program with a deep, almost spiritual love for literature, the classics, the great philosophical novels. She viewed them as voices speaking to universal human conditions, struggles of consciousness, shared existential questions. She genuinely believed in the power of narrative to bridge time and culture.
But her curriculum, her program, it wasn't particularly interested in prose or character or universal struggle.
No. Her experience demonstrates how the grammatical tool of identity was transformed into an obligatory lens, a weapon within postmodern critical theory. Instead of analyzing narrative structure or universal themes, her program required her to deconstruct the author's identities as mere manifestations of power structures, race, class, gender, which were seen to determine everything they were allowed to say and what their work was allowed to mean.
So, for example, if William Faulkner wrote about the burden of the past, the student was primarily tasked with analyzing Faulkner's identity as a wealthy, white Southern male, and then concluding that his work must be an expression of entrenched power.
Exactly. The source explains that when Sarah tried to write a paper on individual consciousness and agency in a novel, her approach was dismissed as reactionary because it failed to center the systemic identity critiques that were required by the prevailing critical theory in her department. The framework was obligatory, it was rigid, and it was preemptive.
It turns genuine intellectual exploration into a kind of ideological hurdle race.
It creates what some describe as a rigid postmodern cage. Instead of expanding the mind through genuine intellectual history and seeking connection across time and culture, the student gets trapped in a systemic critique that sacrifices awe and human connection for the sake of deconstruction.
So the very tools, literature, art, philosophy that allow us to transcend our circumstances are subverted into instruments for classifying and judging the identities of authors and characters.
Yes. The ultimate effect is that the human experience, in all of its complexity, gets reduced to a set of political classifications.
Okay, so let's move into some of the pathologies that arise from these dynamics. When identity becomes a primary currency, a medium for distributing political capital, resources, recognition, it seems to lead to some highly competitive and often destructive social dynamics.
It does. The fundamental pathology is that marginalization itself becomes a desirable, highly contested asset.
And this takes us directly to the concept known as the oppression Olympics.
The term oppression Olympics is a critical framework for diagnosing this dynamic of competitive victimhood. It describes a situation where marginalization is viewed as a competition to determine who is most oppressed, by comparing categories like race, gender, sexuality, disability, and so on, in order to gain maximum visibility and command the allocation of political and institutional resources.
When did this dynamic first become noticeable enough to get a name?
It arose prominently among feminist scholars in the 1990s. They were critiquing the tendency of various subgroups within the feminist movement to prioritize competitive self-interest over shared cooperation. The Chicana feminist Elizabeth Martinez is often credited with an early direct mention in 1993 when she called for unity, stating very clearly that no competition of hierarchy should prevail, no oppression Olympics.
And in this competition, what does the supposed winner actually achieve? What's the prize?
The gold medal is seen as securing the commanding position for demanding systemic change, for institutional visibility, and crucially, for the allocation of finite resources, everything from grant money to committee seats.
So it's about power.
It is. And within these competitive groups, identity itself is often fetishized and judged according to preconceived, essentialist terms of suffering. This naturally leads to the pathological dynamic of agreeing with the most marginalized person in the room, which establishes an internal hierarchy based on perceived suffering and vulnerability.
This dynamic seems inherently corrosive. It seems counterproductive to the original goal of liberation. I mean, if you're competing over who is suffering more, you're unable to forge the solidarity you need to challenge the systemic source of that suffering.
That is the central criticism. Critics argue that this dynamic is intellectually lazy, relying on emotional weight rather than political depth, and ultimately it leads to tokenization. Instead of unifying for wider collective action, it fosters internal social hierarchy building and division. Groups end up competing for the title of the most grievously oppressed, which diverts all this energy away from genuine social transformation.
And we can see that this competitive comparison of suffering has been a challenge for groups historically, long before the modern identity paradigm was even a thing.
Oh, absolutely. The historian Peter Novick used the related term victimization Olympics to describe persecuted groups competing to portray themselves as the most oppressed. One of the clearest, earliest illustrations of this is found in James Baldwin's commentary from way back in 1967. Baldwin was discussing the friction between Black and Jewish experiences of suffering in America.
What was his specific observation?
Baldwin argued that the Jewish travail, the horrors of the Holocaust, occurred across the sea, and America was viewed correctly as a place of refuge and rescue for them. By contrast, he said, America is the house of bondage for the Negro. Baldwin noted that one does not wish to be told by an American Jew that his suffering is as great as the American Negro's suffering, because in that specific American context, one knows that it isn't.
It's such a sharp observation.
It is, and it just shows how deeply embedded the human tendency is to judge and rank suffering, establishing these hierarchies of victimhood, even among those who are collectively oppressed.
So we have this political dynamic driven by competition for recognition. Let's bring the economic analysis back in. What does this hyper-focus on difference, on the ownership of a personal label mean for the architecture of global capitalism, particularly the transition toward neoliberalism?
This is where the political impulse converges, some would say fatally, with economic reality. The transition from organized capitalism, which focused on the mass market and labor unions, to neoliberal capitalism has fundamentally subjugated the social sense of identity to the personal sense.
So the revolutionary collectivist impulse of the 60s group identity gets absorbed and individualized by the consumption-oriented logic of neoliberalism.
That's the argument. If identity is about asserting difference in individual expression, then capitalism looks at that difference and says, that's not a struggle, that's a market segment. There is an easy, almost inevitable slippage between identity politics and niche markets. We've seen the rise of targeted demographics, the bank-bound, the gray dollar. Corporations very quickly realized that by paying lip service to identity recognition, they could simultaneously segment consumers in obscure underlying economic exploitation. You can think of the corporate exploitation of Black identity politics by companies like Avon in the 1970s. Suddenly, products were being marketed specifically to empower Black consumers, while the corporation itself remained completely committed to the core tenets of profit maximization and capital extraction. Identity becomes a commodity.
And this emphasis on the individual consumer of identity leads to what our source calls a strangely libertarian version of identity politics because it prioritizes individual rights and recognition over collective power.
It absolutely does. The intensification of market processes means identity politics tends to focus heavily on the individual rights held by the self-conscious bearer of an identity. The right to recognition, the right to self-definition, the right to equal opportunity in the market, over any sense of unified group solidarity or systemic power critique.
So groups seek equality of opportunity, recognition, and distribution within the existing neoliberal framework of private property and entrepreneurial freedoms.
Yes, so the radical project shifts from overthrowing the exploitative system to simply getting better representation within that exploitative system.
Which, from a systemic perspective, is no threat at all.
The focus on representation and inclusion via commodification allows groups to seek equality within the existing neoliberal architecture. This is a profound institutionalization of difference. And some critical theorists view this as highly pathological. They argue that the left's identity politics and the right's neoliberalism are two dialectical sides of the same fascistic coin.
Okay, that's a very strong accusation. We need to be clear that this is a critique advanced by certain theorists. Not a statement of fact, but it's a necessary perspective to explore. How do they justify calling this convergence a fascistic coin?
They argue that both forces operate as pathologies of modernity that ultimately institutionalize difference. Neoliberalism institutionalizes difference through the logic of competitive, individualized market participation and consumption. Identity politics, when it's severed from its original anti-capitalist goals, institutionalizes difference by making classification and recognition the primary goal.
So both mechanisms just manage difference, they don't overcome it.
That's the critique. Both mechanisms, market integration and identity classification, fail to proffer a true alternative to the exploitative world system. They are seen as two different but equally effective mechanisms for system maintenance and social integration, which makes the conflict between them largely symbolic and internal to the system itself.
So if we accept that language and economic forces have conspired to trap us in categories and competition and endless internal debate, where is the way out? The material suggests that the antidote is often found not in more language or more theory, but in the immediate, unavoidable demands of reality.
That's really the essence of a post-identity framework, moving beyond the symbolic realm and back into the concrete reality of shared civic purpose. And the most compelling illustration of this principle comes from the story of a community garden project in Berlin.
This story is fantastic because it demonstrates the immediate collapse of the symbolic in the face of the material.
It took place in a highly polarized suburb where conservative retirees and young non-binary activists have been locked in this bitter, continuous conflict. They were hurling identity-based insults at each other in town halls and across online forums. The conflict was defined entirely by their tribes and their labels, their abstract identities.
They saw each other as political categories first and people a distant second.
Until the moment of a physical crisis. The garden they shared, a piece of land that was vital to both groups for very different reasons, was suddenly threatened by a major flooding event after a severe storm. The material reality intervened.
And the narrator made the powerful observation that the mud didn't care about their pronouns or their voting records.
The labels dissolved instantly. Yeah. The urgency of saving their shared, tangible project, the literal tomatoes and cabbages, overrode all symbolic divisions. An older gentleman who identified strictly with traditional nationalist values found himself working shoulder to shoulder, frantically sandbagging the perimeter with a young activist he had previously denounced online.
Their communication must have changed completely.
It did. They weren't communicating through identity terms. They were communicating through necessity. Lift here, hold that, more sand.
In that shared purpose, they returned to their essential state as cooperating individuals. Their labels, which had been so critical just moments earlier, became entirely irrelevant.
And that suggests the antidote to fragmentation isn't more dialogue about our internal symbolic differences, but a return to universalist principles through shared action and mutual reliance on reality. In that moment of shared civic purpose, they return to individual sovereignty, defined not by their abstract categories or tribes, but by their accepted responsibilities toward a common material goal.
So the path forward, then, is practical and strategic. We can use the concept of identity when it helps us foster solidarity, like the original Black Power movement did. But we have to be prepared to abandon it when it promotes individualism, competition, class blindness, or exclusionary divisions, which is often its default mode in late-stage capitalism.
It becomes a question of ethical utility. We choose to use the word when it serves reality, and we discard it when it obscures reality.
Finally, let's explore the deepest philosophical challenge to the idea of identity, the outright rejection of the self as a stable, persistent entity. If the self doesn't even exist on an ultimate level, then the label identity becomes meaningless.
This is the radical rejection known as the no-self theory, or anatta in Buddhist philosophy. But it also has a surprising and powerful parallel in the Western tradition, articulated by the philosopher David Hume back in the 18th century. Hume was the first Western philosopher to fully reject the notion of personal identity, calling it a fictitious construct.
What was Hume's famous internal experiment? What did he find when he tried to look inward and locate the self?
Hume said, "When I enter most intimately into what I call myself, I always stumble on some particular perception or other of heat or cold, light or shade, love or hatred, pain or pleasure. And his conclusion from this was radical. He never catches a constant, invariable impression of a self. He only finds a continuous flow of successive perceptions.
So there's never any simplicity in the mind at one time, nor identity at two different times. It's just an endless torrent of experiences passing through.
Exactly. He concluded that the identity we ascribe to the mind, much like the identity we ascribe to a gradually repaired ship or a rebuilt church, is only a fictitious identity. We ascribe identity to this flow of perceptions not because a permanent entity actually exists, but simply because the transition of thought between these closely related successive perceptions is smooth and easy. Our mind likes continuity, so it fabricates it.
So the very identity we fight to defend is just a convenient illusion we invent to keep our thoughts streamlined. How does this connect back to the practical linguistic use of the word? We still have to say I.
We do. And both Hume and Buddhist philosophy offer a crucial distinction here. Identity language can be used on a conventional level, but is false on the ultimate level. The conventional level allows us to use terms like I, self, or even our own proper names for pragmatic, practical reasons. It's dictated by linguistic convention.
This is the famous Buddhist dialogue, isn't it? The exchange about the chariot.
It's a perfect illustration. The dialogue is between the Buddhist monk Nagasena and King Menander. The king asks Nagasena what he is. Is he his body, his mind, or some combination? Nagasena rejects all possibilities, stating he is only a generally understood term, a practical designation.
He's just a name.
Yes. And then Nagasena turns the question back on the king. He asks Menander to identify the chariot he arrived in. Is it the pole, the wheels, the axle? Menander eventually realizes the chariot is merely a sound, a concept that only exists derived from its components. Nagasena's rejoinder is that Nagasena is the same, merely an expression, a turn of speech, a designation. The word works for getting things done, but it doesn't refer to a permanent entity.
This means we can still function in the world. We can still say, I am going to the store, without committing a philosophical error about having a permanent soul.
Precisely. This is why Hume could assert that all these nice and subtle questions concerning personal identity are best considered as grammatical rather than philosophical difficulties. The linguistic concession allows us to use I think for practicality, but philosophers like George Christoph Lichtenberg suggested that instead of saying I think, we should perhaps say it thinks, similar to saying it thunders.
Acknowledging the I as a necessary but non-referring grammatical subject.
Exactly.
So if the ultimate self is a fiction, what is the self-awareness we feel? That singular, unified, constant sense of who we are that we feel so compelled to protect and define.
What we experience as self-awareness, the object of passions like pride or humility, what we often call our ego or our identity, is not the ultimate self. It is a constructed self-image. It's a rare, secondary psychological phenomenon. It is a condensation of related ideas and experiences. Body images, emotions, actions, memories.
A kind of psychological collage that's constantly being updated.
Exactly. This condensation temporarily presents itself in a dense, singular form to our awareness, and it masquerades as a self that has persisted over time. This object is composed of nothing more than a collection of transient images. Just as we can call up a condensed image of a friend that's composed of several different fading portraits superimposed on one another, our self-image is built from fluid, temporal perceptions. It is the result of consciousness throwing itself into a specific configuration, but it is not a fixed, enduring entity.
And the practical danger is that this constructed self-image is what we are fighting so hard to defend when we defend our identity in the political sphere. We mistake a fleeting, psychological construct for our eternal essence. We confuse the map we drew with the infinite, fluid landscape we actually inhabit.
We've seen how the word identity was born in the dual fires of commerce and counterculture, evolving rapidly from a grammatical reference point, the it thing, into a central, often volatile, social and political currency. We trace the intellectual cost when that placeholder is mistaken for the landscape of the soul, turning the necessary pursuit of self-discovery into the rigid performance of a label, and political engagement into a competition for the status of most oppressed.
We trace the transformation of a simple tool, designed only to point to it, into a massive symbolic territory that requires fierce defense and constant performance. You are not a theory, you are not a brand. You are a living presence, defined by what you do and what you love in the present moment, not by the labels you choose to inherit or acquire. You are not an it thing. You are more than the word that tries to contain you. You already are.